Elon Musk Chapter 22 Kauai SpaceX 2005-2006 Catch 22 Musk had planned to launch SpaceX rocket from one of the most convenient possible locations, Vandenberg Air Force Base, a 100,000-acre facility on the California coast near Santa Barbara. Rockets and other equipment could easily be driven there from the SpaceX headquarters and factory in Los Angeles, about 160 miles to the south. The problem was that the base was run by the Air Force, which treated rules and requirements as sacred. This did not sit well with Musk, who was instilling a culture based on questioning every rule and assuming that every requirement was dumb until proven otherwise. The Air Force and us were such a mismatch, says Hans Koensberg, Koensman, who was a SpaceX chief launch engineer. They had some requirements that Elon and I laughed about so hard that we would have to catch our breath. After a moment's reflection, he adds, they probably laughed at us the same way. Making matters worse, Vandenberg was scheduled to be used to launch a super secret 1 billion spy satellite. In the spring of 2005, just as SpaceX Falcon 1 was getting ready, the Air Force decreed that SpaceX would not be able to use its pad until the satellite was safely launched, and they could offer no timetable when they might happen. SpaceX had no one covering its expenses. It did not have a cost plus contract, and it got paid only when it launched or delivered on certain milestones. Lockheed, on the other hand, profited whenever there was a delay. After a conference call with the Air Force bureaucrats in May 2005, during which he realized that SpaceX would not give permission to launch anytime soon, Musk called Tom Booza and told him to start packing. They were going to move the rocket to another site. Fortunately, they had one available. Unfortunately, it was inconvenient as Vandenberg was convenient. Gwen Shotwell had scored for SpaceX a $6 million deal in 2003 to launch a communication satellite from Malaysia. The problem was that the satellite was so heavy that it needed to be launched near the equator, where the faster rotation of the Earth's surface would provide the extra thrust that was needed. Well, that's really interesting. Shotwell invited Kongsmin into her cubicle on SpaceX, spread out a map of the world, and moved her fingers west along the equator. There was nothing to be found until halfway across the Pacific, the Marshall Islands, about 4,800 miles from Los Angeles. It was near the international date line, but nothing else. Once a U.S. territory that was used as an atomic weapon and missile test site. The Marshall Islands had become an independent republic, but remained closely aligned with the U.S., which maintained military bases there. One of them was on the string of a tiny coral and sand islets known as the Kwalian Atoll. Kwalian Island, known as Kauai, is the largest speck in the atoll. It's home to the U.S. Army base with Fralin hotel facilities that resemble dormitories and a landing strip that tries to pass for an airport 3 days a week. There was a flight from Honolulu. Factoring in layovers, it took close to 20 hours to get from Los Angeles to Kauai. When Shotwell searched Kauai, she found that the facilities were run by the Army Space and Missile Defense Command headquarters in Huntsville, Alabama. The person in charge was Mayor Tim Mango, a name that made Musk laugh. It's like something out of Catch 22, he says. A person at the Pentagon decides to pick someone named Major Mungo to run a tropical island base. Musk called Mango out of the blue and explained that he had been a founder of PayPal and had gone into the rocket launching business. Mango listened for a couple of minutes and hung up on him. I thought he was nuts, Mango told Eric Berger of Ars Technica. Mango then did a Google search on Musk and saw a picture of him next to his $1 million McLaren. Read that he had started a company called SpaceX and realized that he was for real. Scrolling through the SpaceX website, Mango found the company's phone number and dialed it. The same person with a slight South African accent answered. Hey, did you just hang up on me? Musk asked. Mango agreed to visit Musk in Los Angeles. After they talked for a while in his cubicle, he invited Mango to a nice restaurant for dinner. Mango checked with his government ethics officer, who told him he would have to pick up the tab. So they went to Applebee's instead, and Musk and some of his team were reciprocated by flying a month later. to Huntsville to meet with Mango and his team. This time they ate better, going to a local roadside joint that featured catfish served fried with the head on. Musk ate one, along with some hush puppies. He wanted to make a deal. So did Mayor Mango. His base on Kauai, like many such installations, was expected to hustle for commercial contracts to cover up to half of their budget. So Major Mango was rolling out the red carpet for us, while the Air Force was giving us the cold shoulder at Vandenberg. Musk says. On the flight from Huntsville, Musk told his team, "Let's go to Kauai." A few weeks later, they flew on his jet to the remote atoll, took a tour in an open door helicopter, and decided to move their launch site there. This side of paradise. Years later, Musk would admit that moving to Kauai was a mistake. He should have waited for Vandenberg to become available. But that would have required patience, a virtue that he lacked. "I did not realize what a shit show it would be dealing with the logistics and the salt air," he says of Kauai. "Every now and then you shoot yourself in the foot. If you had to pick a path that reduced the probability of success, it would be a launch from an inaccessible tropical island." Then he laughs. Now that the scars have healed, he realizes that Kauai was a memorable adventure. As his chief launch engineer, Coinsman explains, "Those 4 years on Kauai forged us, bonded us, and taught us to work as a team. A hardy bond of SpaceX engineers moved to the brackets on Kauai Island. The launch site itself was 20 miles away on an even tinier island in the atoll known as Lake, about 700 feet wide and uninhabited. It was accessible by a 45-minute catamaran ride, a trip that could cause a sunburn even through a t-shirt in the early morning. There, the SpaceX team set up a double-wide trailer as an office and poured concrete for launch pad. After a few months, some of the crew decided it was easier to sleep on the Omalak rather than make the trip across the lagoon each morning and night. They outfitted the trailer with mattresses, a small refrigerator, and a grill, which a javelin goateed SpaceX engineer from Turkey named Bülent Altan perfected a way to cook ground beef and yogurt goulash. The atmosphere was a cross between Gilligan's Island and Survivor, but with a rocket pad. Each time a new piece stayed overnight, they were awarded a t-shirt imprinted with the mantra, "Out sweat, out drink, out launch." At Musk's insistence, the crew devised ways to save money. Instead of paying the 150-yard path between the hangar and the launch pad, they rigged up a cradle on wheels to transport the rocket, laid pieces of plywood on the ground, rolled the rocket a few feet, then moved the plywood to smooth the way by rolling the next feet. How scrappy and non-buoyant were the crew on Kauai. In early 2006, they planned to conduct a static fire test. Once that ignites the engines briefly while the rocket stays attached to the launch pad. But when they began the test, they discovered that not enough electrical power was reaching the second stage. It turned out that the power boxes designed by Alton, the goulash cooking engineer, had captures that would not handle the juiced up voltage the launch team had decided to use. Alton was horrible because the window the Army had given them for the static test ended 4 days earlier. He scrambled to put something together. A save. The captors were available in an electronic supply house in Minnesota. An intern in Texas was dispatched there. Meanwhile, Alton removed the power boxes from the rocket on Molek, jumped on a boat to Kauai, slept on a concrete slab outside of the airport waiting for the early morning flight to Honolulu, and made the connection to Los Angeles, where he was picked up by his wife, who drove him to SpaceX headquarters. There, he met the intern, who arrived from Minnesota with the new capacitors. He swapped them into the facility power boxes and rushed home to change clothes during the 2 hours it took for the boxes to be tested. Then he and Musk jumped in a Musk jet for the dash back to Kauai, taking the intern with them as his reward. Alton hoped to sleep on the plane. He had been awake for most of 40 hours, but Musk bombarded him with questions on every detail of the circuitry. A helicopter whisked them from the quiet airstrip to Omelek, where Alton put the repaired boxes into the rocket. They worked. The 3-second static fire test was a success, and the first full launch attempt of Falcon 1 was scheduled for a few weeks later. Chapter 23, 2 Strikes, Kauai 2006 to 2007. The first launch attempt. Want to go for a bike ride? Kimball asked his brother when they woke at 6 a.m. They had flown to Kauai for the scheduled launch date, March 24, 2006. When Elon hoped that Falcon 1 rocket he had dreamed of 4 years earlier would make history. No, I need to go to the control center, Elon replied. Kimball pushed back. The launch isn't until later. Let's go for a ride. It'll be a stress reliever. Elon relented, and they pedaled at the furious pace up a bluff where they could take in the sunrise. There, Elon stood silently for a long time, staring into the distance before heading to the control room. Wearing shorts and a black t-shirt, he paced amid the government-issued wooden desks. When Musk gets dressed, he often retreats into the future. He was surprised his engineers, who were focused on some impending major event, by peppering them with questions about the details of things that are years away, plans for Mars landings, robo-taxis, about steering wheels, implanted brain chips that can connect to computers. At Tesla, amid the crisis-facing productions of the Roadsters, he would start quizzing the team about the status of parts for the next car he envisioned. Now on Kauai, as the countdown for the first launch of the Falcon 1 entered its final hour, Musk was asking his engineers about the components needed for the Falcon 5, the future rocket that would have 5 Merlin engines. Have they ordered a new type of aluminum alloy for the fuel tanks? He asked a haired Chris Thompson, who was sitting at his console overseeing the countdown. When Thompson, one of the SpaceX first engineers, said no, Musk got angry. We were right there, smack in the middle of a count, and he just wanted to have this deep, aggressive conversation about materials, Thompson later told Eric Berger. I was absolutely dumbfounded that he was not even aware that we were trying to launch a rocket, and then I was the launch conductor and responsible for basically calling out every single command that we're going to run. It just blew me away. Only at the moment of launch did Musk again focus on the present. As the Falcon 1 lifted off the pad, and the engineers in the control room pumped their fists into the air, Musk stared at the video feed from a camera pointed down from the rocket's second stage. 20 seconds into the flight, it showed the pristine beach and turquoise water of Omelek in the distance. It's launched, Kimball said. It's really launched. Then about 5 more seconds, Tom Mueller, who was looking at the data coming in, noticed a problem. Oh shit, he said. We're losing thrust. Kongsman saw flames flickering around the outside of the engine. Oh shit, he said, echoing Mueller. There's a fire a leak. For a moment, Musk hoped that the rocket would make it up high enough that the dwindling oxygen in the atmosphere would cause the flame to stuff out. Instead, it started to fall. On the video feed, Omelek began to come closer. Then the video went blank. Burning debris fell into the ocean. My stomach wrenched, Musk says. An hour later, he and his top team, Mueller, Kongens, Verbuza, and Thompson, crammed into an army helicopter to save the wreckage. That night, everyone gathered in the open-air bay on Kauai and quietly sipped beer. A couple of the engineers cried. Musk brooded silently, his face like a stone and his eyes distant. Then he spoke, very softly. When we started, we all knew we would fail on the first mission, he said. But we will build another rocket and try again. Musk and the rest of the SpaceX team were joined by local volunteers the next day as they walked the beach of Omelek and rowed in small boats to collect the fragments. We put the pieces in a hangar and pieced them together as we tried to figure out what went wrong, Koensberg says. Kimball, a passionate foodie who trained as a chef after Zip Told was sold, tried to cheer everyone up that evening by cooking an outdoor meal that included a stew of meat, canned cannoli beans, and tomato, with a salad of bread, tomatoes, garlic, and anchovies. As Musk and his top engineers flew on his jet back to Los Angeles, they studied the video. Mueller pointed out the moment when the plane broke on the Merlin engine. It had clearly been caused by a fuel leak. Musk simmered, then exploded at Mueller. Do you know how many people told me I should fire you? Why don't you just fire me? Mueller shot back. I didn't fucking fire you, did I? Musk said. You're still fucking here. Then tried to relieve tension. Musk pulled on the wacky action film spoof Team America World Police, as often happened when Musk's darkness gave way to silly humor. Later that night, he posted a statement. SpaceX is in this for the long haul. Come hell or high water, we're going to make this work. Musk had a rule about responsibility. Every part, every process, and every specification needs to have a name attached. He can be quick to personalize blame when something goes wrong. In the case of the launch failure, it became evident that the leak had come into a small bee nut that secured a fuel line. Musk fingered an engineer named Jeremy Holman, one of the Mueller's first hires, who the night before the launch had removed and then reattached the nut in order to get access to a valve. At a public symposium a few days later, Musk described the mistake for one of our most experienced technicians and insiders, and knew he was referring to Holman. Holman had stayed behind in Kauai for 2 weeks to analyze the debris. On his flight from Honolulu to Los Angeles, he was reading news stories about the failure and was shocked to see that Musk had blamed him. As soon as he landed, he drove the 2 miles from the airport to SpaceX headquarters and barged into Musk's cubicle. A shouting match erupted, and both Shotwell and Mueller went over to try to calm things down. Holman wanted the company to track Musk's statement, and Mueller asked for permission to do so. I'm the CEO, Musk replied. I'm the one that deals with the press, so stay out of it. Holman told Mueller he would stay at the company only if he never had to deal directly with Musk. He left SpaceX a year later. Musk says he doesn't remember the event, but he adds that Holman was not a great engineer. Mueller disagrees. We lost a good guy. As it turns out, Holman was not at fault. When the fuel line was found, part of the B nut was still attached, but it was corroded and cracked in half. The sea air of Kauai was to blame. The second attempt. After the failure of the first launch, SpaceX became more cautious. The team began testing carefully and recording the details of each of the hundreds of components in the rocket. For once, Musk did not push everyone to move at warp speed and sweep away caution. Nevertheless, he did not try to eliminate all possible risks that could make SpaceX rockets as costly and late as those built by the government's bloated cost-plus contractors. So he demanded a chart showing every component, the cost of its raw materials, the cost that SpaceX was paying suppliers for it, and the name of the engineer responsible for getting that cost down. At meetings, he would sometimes show that he knew these numbers better than the engineers doing the presentation, which was not a pleasant experience. Review meetings could be brutal, but costs came down. All this meant taking calculated risk. For example, Musk had been the one who approved the use of cheap and light aluminum for the B nut that corroded and doomed the first Falcon 1 flight. Another example involved what are known as sulfish baffles. As a rocket ascends, the fuel remaining in its tanks can slosh around. To prevent this, rigged metal rings can be attached to the inside wall of the tank. The engineers did that in the first stage of the Falcon 1, but adding mass to the upper stage was more of a problem because it could be thrust all the way into orbit. Congelman's team ran a variety of computer simulations to test the risk from sloshing. Only in a tiny percentage of the models it seemed to be a problem. In the list they made of the top 15 risks, number 1 was the possibility that the thin material they were using for the rocket shell might bend in flight. Second stage sloshing was ranked number 11. When Musk went over the list from Koensman and his engineers, he decided that he would accept some of the risks, including slosh. The likelihood of most of these risks would not be determined just by simulations. The risk of slosh would have to be tested in a real flight. The test came in March 2007, as it had an earlier year. The launch started well. The countdown reached 0. The Merlin engine ignited, and the Falcon 1 lumbered toward space. This time, Musk was watching from the control room at SpaceX headquarters in Los Angeles. Yes, we made it, Mueller shouted, hugging him. As the second stage made its planned separation, Musk bit his lip, then started to smile. Congratulations, Musk said. I'm going to watch that video for a long time. For 5 full minutes, enough time to pop open a couple of bottles of champagne. There was jubilation. Then Mueller noticed something on the video. The second stage was beginning to wobble. The data feed confirmed his fears. I knew right away it was slosh, he says. On the video, it looked like Earth was trembling in a dryer, but it was actually the second stage spinning. Catch it, an engineer yelled. But by then it was hopeless. At the 11 mark, the feed went blank. The second stage and its payload were crashing back to Earth from 180 miles up. The rocket had reached outer space, but had failed to get into orbit. The decision to accept the 11th item on the risk list to not incorporate slosh baffles had came back to bite them. From now on, Musk said to Koensman, we're going to have 11 items on the list risks, never just 10.